In the middle of a dusty Nevada field under a sky too wide to hide from, a young Japanese nurse, sunburned, disoriented, still in the remnants of a tattered military uniform, stood surrounded by 14 American cowboys in denim, boots, and broad-brimmed hats. She was the only woman, the only enemy, and she waited for the cruelty she'd been promised, but instead one of them took off his hat. Another whistled low, not in mockery, but in surprise. Someone called for water. Someone else offered food. And then, impossibly, they all sat down around her in a wide circle like she was one of them. She didn't know it then, but this was not the end of her war. This was the beginning of her transformation, one that would unravel every oath, every fear, and every lie she'd ever been taught. What happened in that moment did not make sense. Not to her. But it would change everything. The first thing she noticed was the sky. So wide it looked like it could swallow her whole. In the Pacific, the canopy above had always been dense, choked with smoke or monsoon clouds. But here, in the middle of the Nevada basin, it stretched open and blue like something unguarded. The second thing she noticed was the silence. No barking orders, no boots against concrete, no cages. Only wind stirring the dust and the low, distant creak of a windmill turning with the rhythm of the land. She didn't understand. She'd been captured in the Philippines, processed on a transport ship, and told she'd be shipped to a place where the Americans kept their women prisoners. What she imagined was a camp ringed with wire and hate. What she stepped into was an open field, dry and sun-bleached, with a weathered barn to one side and 14 men in wide-brimmed hats standing in a loose semicircle, staring at her like she had walked out of a dream. They weren't in uniform, at least not the kind she had trained to fear. Their pants were dusty denim, their shirts rolled up at the sleeves, their boots worn. Some leaned on fence posts. Others stood with thumbs hooked in belt loops. A few carried rifles, but not like soldiers. The weapons were slung low, as if forgotten. None of them shouted. None of them moved. She felt their eyes on her, but there was no jeer, no whistle. Just watching, assessing. She clutched her small bundle tighter. A blanket, a canteen, a photograph of her mother folded between pages of a field manual. The MPs who had dropped her off had said only, "You're assigned here for kitchen work. These men won't bother you. You won't need a fence." Then they left. She watched the jeep disappear over the horizon and felt her chest collapse with panic. No fence, no gate, only a water pump and a horizon that never ended. One of the cowboys stepped forward, middle-aged, leathery skin, a ragged mustache. He didn't speak, just pointed toward the barn, then to a small shed behind it. The implication was clear. That would be hers. She nodded, not because she understood, but because she didn't know what else to do. Her feet moved automatically. Her back ached from days of travel, and her nerves were wound so tight she flinched when the door creaked. The shed was clean, Spartan, but clean. A cot, a pitcher of water, a basin, no chains, no guards, no locks. The smell of wood and dust overwhelmed her. She stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, unable to set down her bundle, unable to breathe fully. Her training had never prepared her for this. That night, a tray appeared outside her door, a plate of beans, a square of cornbread, a tin cup of coffee. Still warm. She looked around, heart hammering. No one in sight. Was this a test? Poison? Trickery? She touched the food like it might vanish. Her fingers trembled as she brought the bread to her lips. It was soft, sweet. It tasted like something from childhood, though she couldn't name what. She chewed slowly, then faster, as if afraid it might be taken back. In the distance, she heard laughter. Casual, low, not cruel. The cowboys were sitting around a fire. One was playing a harmonica. The music floated across the plain, sad and oddly tender. She sat on the cot, the tray balanced on her knees, and felt the heat of the food seep into her belly. What kind of prison was this? No barking guards, no sirens, just men in hats and boots who spoke softly and moved like the land itself, patient, steady. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, though the night was not cold. Her pulse finally slowed, but her mind raced. She had been prepared to resist, to endure, to die if needed. Not this. Not cornbread and music and a place to sleep where the wind slipped through the slats in the wood and carried the scent of hay. She was the only woman, the only Japanese, the only prisoner, it seemed. And yet they had looked at her not with hatred, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or worse, decency. She curled onto her side, facing the wall, her fingers still sticky with crumbs. The food had filled her stomach, but it left something else behind. A question she couldn't answer, one that clung to her skin even after she washed her hands in the basin. If this was the enemy, then what had she been fighting for? The next morning she awoke to the scent of something frying, onions perhaps, or bacon. For a few moments she thought it was a dream, a memory clinging to her sleep like smoke. But then came the clatter of pans, the creak of a door, and a knock that was somehow gentle. She sat up, unsure whether to answer. Outside, a voice called something in English. The words meant nothing, but the tone was unmistakable. Time to eat. She stepped out, squinting against the sun. The ranch stretched before her, all rough fences and golden fields. At a long wooden table set beneath a cottonwood tree, the cowboys were already gathering, plates in hand. Someone pointed to a spot for her. She hesitated. It had to be a trap. No one ate with the enemy, yet no one stopped her as she approached. A man with red dust on his boots handed her a plate. She took it like it might burn her fingers. Beans, stewed tomatoes, 2 thick slices of bread, and again that sweet, crumbly cornbread. She sat apart at first, near the edge of the table. The men gave her space, not out of fear, but something that felt closer to politeness. They didn't gawk, they didn't joke. One tipped his hat in her direction. Another offered a jug of water and gestured with 2 fingers, asking if she wanted some. She nodded, mute with confusion. She watched them eat. They chewed slowly, deliberately, pausing between bites to talk or laugh. Some rolled cigarettes with dirt-stained fingers. One leaned back on a stool, balancing it on 2 legs like it was a dance. They were rough men, sun-browned and wind-wrinkled, but there was nothing brutal in their posture. She had imagined tormentors. Instead, she found ranchers. Later that day, she was led to the kitchen, not with a guard at her back, but with a quiet word from an older man who seemed to be in charge. He showed her a pantry full of unfamiliar ingredients: flour, canned peaches, dried beans, bottles of oil. Then he handed her a simple recipe book, its pages stained and curled at the corners. He tapped one page and said, "Tomorrow," then patted his stomach and smiled. She didn't know what unsettled her more, the food, the trust, or the smile. That night she sat alone again, a plate balanced on her knees. She ate slowly, but her body betrayed her. Each bite made her remember how hungry she had been, not just during transport, but for months before. In the last weeks of the war, she and the other nurses had survived on rice stretched with bark, on thin broth made from wilted greens. Meat was fantasy, sugar, myth. Her stomach had shrunk. Now it throbbed with the strangeness of fullness. She imagined her mother in Osaka, probably boiling weeds, probably thinner than she had ever been. Her youngest brother had gone off to war. Her sister had worked in a munitions factory until it was bombed. And here she was, in a prison, yes, but one where the prisoners ate cornbread and stew. The guilt crawled up her throat and sat behind her ribs. This was not how it was supposed to be. She had whispered an oath once, standing straight in a dusty field, swearing to serve the emperor and to die before dishonor. But what did dishonor mean when the enemy handed you a spoon and asked for your help in cooking breakfast? She lay awake that night, staring at the slatted ceiling, her fingers pressed against her lips. The taste still lingered. Salt, smoke, butter. It filled her with something like grief. This wasn't surrender. It was worse. It was being cared for. And somehow it was undoing her faster than any battlefield ever could. In the morning she stood in the kitchen alone, sleeves rolled to her elbows, flour dusting the tips of her fingers. The stove hissed with heat, and the scent of bacon, thick, greasy, unmistakably American, curled through the wooden rafters. She moved with practiced caution, though the ingredients were strange. Cans labeled in English. Oats, white sugar, coffee grounds, lard that came in tins instead of animal fat scraped from bones. Each object felt like a puzzle piece from a civilization she had been taught not to believe existed. The cowboys came and went through the doorway, each tipping their hat or muttering something she didn't understand. They never stepped too close, never demanded. One of them, a lanky man with a sunburnt neck, left a dog-eared recipe card on the table with a drawing of a pie on it and the words, "Try this," scrawled beneath. She wasn't sure if it was a command or a suggestion, but she took it home with her that evening like it was a letter from another world. Outside, the rhythm of life at the ranch was unlike any she had known. The men rose early and rode out before the sun crested the far ridge, horses kicking up trails of dust that hung in the air like ghosts. She watched from the window, hands deep in biscuit dough, as they moved across the land, not with domination, but with care. They repaired fences, coiled rope, soothed a skittish colt that refused to be bridled. She had expected barking orders, drills, shouting. Instead, she heard whistling, jokes told in low voices. Once, the older one with the gray beard leaned over the fence and spoke to a cow like it was his grandmother. She kept her distance, but her eyes never stopped moving. She watched them laugh over spilled water, mock each other's hats, swap chores without argument. In their silence was understanding. In their laughter, something dangerous bloomed, familiarity. One afternoon, a storm rolled across the plains. No lightning, only the hush of heavy rain. The men returned early, soaked and grinning, and gathered under the long awning near the barn. Someone handed her a pan, and she fried what meat she had. The smell brought them close, standing in that half-shelter, wet boots steaming. One of them, the youngest, tried to teach her a word. "Rain," he said, pointing upward. Then he said it again. "Rain." She nodded, eyes lowered, lips pressed together. Then he slipped, his boot sliding in a puddle, and went down hard on his back. For a moment, everyone froze. Then came the explosion of laughter, loud, full-bodied, unguarded. The older cowboy slapped his thigh. Another howled and doubled over. Even the horses in the barn shifted in their stalls, restless from the commotion. And she laughed. It was a sharp, startled sound, like a cough or a break. It escaped her before she could stop it, and when the others turned, she clapped a hand over her mouth. But they didn't mock. They didn't freeze. The man on the ground looked up at her, grinned, and said, "Guess even the rain likes a joke." She turned quickly, cheeks burning, and busied herself with the pan. But the sound of her own laughter echoed in her ears. She had not laughed since before the war, not when her village was bombed, not when her brother vanished, not when she had left home for training, head-shaved, pride swelling like a wound. And now, here, among cowboys and mud and cornbread, she had laughed. The rain passed. The sky cleared. The men drifted back to their tasks, boots squelching, still chuckling. She stood at the sink, water running over her hands, and felt something unsteady in her chest, not fear, not shame, but something harder to name. They weren't monsters, they were human. Worse, they were kind. And that, more than any gun, terrified her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The blanket that had once felt like salvation now pressed against her like a question she could not answer. The cot beneath her was soft by any wartime standard, but her back twisted with unease, as though memory itself had hardened into splinters beneath the mattress. Outside, crickets sang, coyotes called from far-off hills, and the wind shifted gently through the wooden slats of her small shed. But inside her mind there was no peace, only drills, oaths, and silence broken by the sound of shouted commands in a voice she had tried to forget. She was back in Manchuria. The sun had not yet risen the morning they lined up. 80 girls in pressed uniforms, heads shaved clean, boots too large for their feet. An officer barked orders, his voice brittle as ice. They repeated their pledges in unison, every vowel carved sharp into the air, to serve without hesitation, to obey without question, to die before surrender. She had repeated the words not out of understanding, but because everyone else did. She was 17. She had never tasted coffee. She had never kissed a boy. But she had learned how to bind a wound and how to hold in her screams. One instructor, a woman with hands like stone, made them chant, "Better to die in honor than live in shame." That line lived inside her bones now, stitched into the walls of her heart. To surrender was to vanish. To survive was to betray. And yet she had surrendered. And worse, she had been allowed to live. When she woke, the smell of biscuits floated in from the kitchen. She dressed slowly, tying her hair back in silence, her body moving on muscle memory while her thoughts cracked beneath the weight of contradiction. The day unfolded like the others, cooking, measuring, cleaning, but every smile from the cowboys cut deeper. Every compliment chipped away at her armor. When the man with the crooked grin told her the biscuits were damn near perfect, she bowed her head and clenched her fists under the counter. That afternoon, she sat under the tree with the others, a plate of stew in her lap. Her appetite had returned in recent days, but now it vanished again. She could feel the eyes of her ancestors, her brother, her mother, the empire, all of them watching her lift a spoon to her mouth, watching her sit among the enemy and eat their food like it was nothing. A cowboy passed by with the pot, offering seconds. He smiled gently, the ladle tilted in her direction. She shook her head once, firmly. He looked surprised, then nodded and moved on. No questions, no scolding, just silence. But inside her something rattled loose. She pushed the rest of the stew away, even though her stomach growled in protest. She would not eat, not tonight. Later, back in the shed, she folded her hands in her lap and stared at the wall. Her mouth was dry. Her temples throbbed. But it wasn't the hunger that unsettled her. It was the act of refusal itself. It had been her first rebellion, not against her captors, but against the quiet betrayal rising within her, against the comfort, the warmth, the terrifying softness of kindness. She thought of her brother the night before he left, standing in the doorway, uniform crisp, face pale. "If I fall," he had whispered. "Don't let them lie about us." She had promised. Now she wasn't sure what the lie was anymore. In the stillness, she whispered one word into the darkness, barely audible even to herself. "Gomenasai." I'm sorry. But she didn't know who the apology was for. Her family, her country, or herself. The sun was low when it happened, spilling gold over the fence posts, catching on dust kicked up by tired boots. She had just finished scrubbing the stew pot, her hands still warm and slick from the water, when the young one, tall, awkward, maybe 19, approached her with a cigarette between his fingers. He didn't speak. He just offered it, the way someone might offer a pebble or a button, casual, weightless. She blinked at it, then at him. He didn't flinch, didn't leer, just struck a match on the heel of his boot, cupped it against the breeze, and lit the end before gently placing it between her fingers. The smell hit her first, smoke and paper, sweet and bitter all at once. It reminded her of her cousin Shinji, who had taught her how to steal dried tobacco from her uncle's desk and roll it in rice paper behind the old bathhouse. He had died in Saipan, or so they said. No body, just the name on a list, and a mother who stopped speaking for 3 weeks. She inhaled, slow. The smoke curled through her lungs, warm as tea. The boy, his name might have been Tom or Tim, she couldn't remember, sat down beside her on the edge of the water trough. Not close, not far, just there. She watched the sky as it turned to lavender, cigarette tip glowing like a small, steady heartbeat between her fingers. He pointed at the food shed and said a word she understood. "Good." Then tapped his chest and said, "Mama cooked like that." She exhaled. A puff of smoke drifted between them. After a pause, she said, "Mama, okay?" He glanced sideways, surprised she'd spoken, then shook his head. "Gone," he said. His voice was rough but not hard, just a word, not a wound. She nodded. "Mine, maybe. I don't know." It wasn't a conversation, not really. It was fragments stitched with silence. But in that silence, something passed between them. Not pity, not sympathy, recognition. Two people sitting in the dust with ghosts between them. She offered the cigarette back. He waved it off. "Keep it," he said. So she did. That night, she made cornbread with extra sugar. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was gratitude, or habit, or maybe something else, something looser, more dangerous, the beginning of comfort. When the same young man returned for seconds, he nodded once, just once, and she caught herself nodding back. Later, as the men played cards under the awning and laughed over some joke she couldn't understand, she sat alone with her feet tucked under her and stared at the cigarette stub now folded into a scrap of cloth beside her cot. Not as a keepsake, as a marker. She was no longer prisoner, not entirely, not always. The man had not looked through her. He had looked at her, not with suspicion or cruelty or even curiosity, but something quieter, something human. She thought about the way he said, "Mama." Not mother, not in formality, but in softness. She remembered the way her own mother used to hum while slicing lotus root, the sound echoing off the kitchen tiles. She hadn't thought of that kitchen in months. She hadn't let herself. Now she did. The next morning, when the boy passed her by, she didn't look away. She met his gaze, just for a breath, and saw no enemy in his eyes. Only dust and smoke, and the same small ache that lived behind her own. The next morning, after breakfast had been cleared, and the cowboys wandered out to mend fences and saddle horses, the foreman approached her with something small in his hand. She stiffened instinctively, ready for an order or correction. Instead, he held out a pencil and a single sheet of paper, folded once down the middle. He didn't smile, Not fully, but his voice was softer than she expected when he said, "Let her home, if you want." For a moment she couldn't move. The pencil seemed impossibly fragile, the paper impossibly white. She had not written a letter since before the surrender, before the evacuations, before her world had shrunk to hunger and marching and the deafening roar of surrender she had never heard spoken aloud. Her fingers trembled as she took the sheet. It was the simplest thing, two objects, light as feathers, yet the weight of them struck her with the force of memory. She retreated to her small shed, closing the door gently as though she held a newborn inside her hands. The paper waited on her cot, impossibly clean. She sat down, the pencil cradled between her thumb and forefinger, and stared at the page as though it were a mirror she had been afraid to look into. What could she write? That she was alive? That she was fed? That the Americans cooked eggs for her and taught her new words and handed her cigarettes with kindness in their eyes? How could she say such things? Who would believe her? Still, she lowered the pencil. "Mother," she wrote, the characters slanted and shaky. "I am alive." Her throat tightened. The pencil paused above the page like a bird too frightened to land. "I am in a place with wide land and men who work with animals," she continued. "It is strange. It is not like the camp I imagined. They treat me kindly." She stopped, staring at that last line until it blurred. Kindness was a dangerous word. Kindness rewrote everything. Kindness threatened the very spine of the stories she had been told, the stories her mother clung to in a country collapsing under fire and famine. What would her mother think if she knew that her daughter ate stew each night and slept on a cot with a clean blanket while their own home might be nothing but dust? She pressed the pencil harder. "I eat well, too well. I am ashamed sometimes." Another pause. Then more. "I think of home often. I hope you are safe. I hope the house is safe. I hope my brothers are safe. I am not hurt. I am not frightened. It is confusing." Her breath faltered at that final word. Confusing. It was the only way she could describe the swirl in her chest, the collision of honor and comfort, memory and mercy. She had been promised cruelty. Instead, she woke each morning to the sound of horses nickering and men laughing softly over coffee. She wrote for a long time, the pencil scratching through her doubts. She wrote about the sun on the plains, about the strange sweetness of American bread, about the boy who offered her a cigarette and didn't expect anything in return. She wrote about the silence at night, the way it unnerved her because there were no bombs, no sirens, no shouts. She wrote until her hand cramped and the page filled, and then she folded it. Not to send. She knew somehow that these words would never reach Japan. Even if they did, no one would believe them. They were too strange, too bright, too soft against the reality of war her family endured. She tucked the letter beneath her blanket, close to where she slept. It was not a message home. It was a confession to herself. A truth blooming quietly, dangerously, in the heart of the enemy's land. Spring came like a whisper, then a roar. One morning the frost lifted from the earth and didn't return. The air warmed. The cottonwoods swayed with lazy confidence, their leaves whispering in a language older than war. And in the soft gold light of those days, she found herself kneeling in the dirt behind the mess hall, hands buried in soil. It started with bok choy, then a few radish seeds, a corner for green onions, nothing extravagant, just the plants she remembered from home, the kind her mother would coax from planters outside their kitchen in Osaka. She had asked, carefully, through broken English and mimed gestures, if she could use the small patch behind the building. The foreman gave her a short nod and pointed to a rusted watering can. Every morning now, before the breakfast bell, she knelt there, The soil was dry and stubborn, nothing like the moist loam of the Japanese countryside, but she worked with it anyway, loosening clumps with a bent spoon, whispering small prayers to seeds buried beneath. She didn't expect much to grow, but that wasn't the point. She needed something to tend that wasn't inside her own chest. One afternoon, as she swept the kitchen floor, the door creaked open, and one of the cowboys stepped in, older, with a limp from some forgotten accident, a face carved by wind and time. He held something in his hand, a small envelope, yellowed at the corners, marked with the word "Wildflowers," in bold, looping letters she didn't recognize. He said nothing, just placed it on the counter, tipped his hat, and walked out. She stared at the packet. No translation, no explanation, just a quiet offering. Later, she opened it over her garden patch, spilling the contents into her palm. Tiny seeds in shades of black, gold, and rust. She didn't know what they would become. She planted them anyway, in a crescent shape along the edge of the vegetables. As she covered them with soil, something inside her softened. Not quite joy, not yet, but something close. The next day, when she passed the cowboy who'd given them to her, she paused. Not long, just enough. She touched her heart with 2 fingers, then pointed gently to the earth. It wasn't a word. It was enough. As days lengthened, the sprouts came, fragile green threads breaking through dirt hardened by war and weather. She watered them quietly, humming songs she hadn't sung since girlhood, melodies about cranes and rivers and the soft pink bloom of cherry blossoms. The cowboys never said much, but one brought her a bucket of kitchen scraps for compost. Another left a pair of gloves on the steps. None of it was spoken. All of it was understood. One morning, as she knelt among the shoots, brushing dust from new leaves, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. A few of the men were standing there, watching, not staring, not intruding, just watching the garden with something like reverence. She didn't think. She smiled. It was small, brief, but real. The men smiled back. One even raised a coffee cup in salute before turning away. No words, no need. She looked back at the soil, at the tender shoots, and thought of home, not as it was during the war, but as it had been before rations, before silence, before she was told who to hate and who to fear. Here, in this foreign land, under foreign skies, something was growing, not just in the ground, in her. And it was silent, and it was slow, but it was healing. The days folded into each other like worn linens, soft with routine, frayed at the edges by memory. She knew the sounds of the ranch now better than her own dreams, the creak of saddle leather in the morning, the distant clatter of hooves, the sharp bark of a dog chasing birds from the trough. These were no longer foreign noises. They were familiar. Not home, perhaps, but something adjacent, something survivable. Each morning after breakfast, before the sun grew fierce, the youngest cowboy, she'd learned his name was Caleb, drew a word into the dirt with a stick. Sky, he'd write, or bread. Sometimes he would write her name, slowly, carefully, and she'd smile at the unfamiliar shape of it in English. She would respond by writing the Japanese equivalent beneath it. Then he'd try to say it, his accent thick, the syllables stumbling out like pebbles over stone. She never corrected him. The effort was enough. In the flour scattered across the counter at midday, she practiced too, carving out hiragana strokes with the edge of her finger, watching as the white powder clung to her skin. They became their own language, she and Caleb, a language built on scratched lines and nods and the occasional shared laugh when he accidentally asked for a shoe instead of sugar. One afternoon, after a storm passed through and left the ground soft and smelling like earth, she returned to her cot and found something resting on her blanket. A wooden spoon, carved by hand, not machine, its handle smooth but imperfect, the bowl slightly crooked, like a smile trying to hide. She turned it over and found, etched on the underside, a tiny sprig of wildflower, the same kind she had planted behind the mess hall. No name, no note, but she knew who had left it. She ran her thumb over the carved petals again and again that night. It wasn't just a tool, it was a message. You are seen, you are remembered, you are not the enemy here. But what was she now? She still wore the same worn uniform, the same patched sleeves. She still woke in a shed behind a mess hall. But the hatred that once kept her spine rigid, that had shielded her like armor, had thinned. The war was not over, but her war, the one inside, had begun to shift. And with that shift came a fear far more disorienting than captivity, the fear of going back. What would happen when the letters stopped? When the ceasefire came, and they told her to pack up her few possessions and return across the ocean to a country she no longer recognized, and that would no longer recognize her? Would she be honored as a survivor, or shunned as a traitor? Would her mother smile when she saw her, or lower her eyes in shame? She didn't know. All she knew was that here on this patch of land she had learned to be something new. Not a soldier, not a prisoner, just a woman with soil under her nails, flour on her apron, and a garden where nothing should have grown. That night, she placed the wooden spoon beside her cot, its carved flower facing the ceiling, and whispered to no one in particular, "Please, let them understand." The stars blinked above in their own language, patient and quiet. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote howled, and the nurse once trained to endure pain without flinching now sat in silence, grateful for the ache in her heart. If you've made it this far into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. The announcement came with the same blunt rhythm as the weather report. One of the officers handed her a slip of paper, eyes unreadable, and said, "Transport in the morning. You're going home." Home. The word echoed in her ribs like a stone dropped into a well. She nodded, folded the paper, and placed it into her apron pocket. Then she stood for a long time in the middle of the kitchen, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, trying to remember how to breathe. No one said much that day. The men didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer answers. But there was a shift, small, quiet. One cowboy brought her a jar of preserved peaches, another filled the water bucket without being asked. Caleb scratched a word into the dust outside the shed. Safe. He didn't say it aloud. He just wrote it, underlined it once, and walked away. That evening, when she stepped into the mess hall for what should have been an ordinary supper, she stopped cold. The long wooden table had been scrubbed until it gleamed. A red checkered cloth, faded but clean, was spread across it, and the plates were already set. 14 of them, theirs, and one new one, tin like the rest, but different. Her name had been scratched into the surface, just beneath the rim, in shaky but deliberate strokes. There was no ceremony, no speeches, only stew, thick and hot, bread fresh from the firebox, corn, pickled cucumbers, and slices of something sweet, apple maybe soaked in syrup. Laughter rolled down the table like a river, easy and unforced. They told stories she couldn't understand fully, but didn't need to. The tones were enough. The way the men leaned in, smacked their thighs, clapped each other's backs. Even the dog got scraps. At one point someone slid an envelope across the table. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. Inside was a photograph, grainy, black and white. The entire group stood in front of the mess hall, squinting into the sun. She was in it too, standing at the far right, arms crossed, a faint smirk on her face. Not smiling, but not scowling either. On the back, in penciled letters, was a single line. "You were never the enemy." Her eyes blurred before she could finish reading it. She folded the photograph and placed it inside her dress. Not her uniform. Her dress. A faded cotton one they had let her keep after the laundry mishap weeks ago. It smelled faintly of soap and ash. It would be the only piece of this place she could wear across the sea. When the meal ended, no one stood. No one saluted. But one by one, the cowboys reached across the table, offering handshakes, nods, a brief touch to the shoulder. She did not cry. Not then. Her heart felt like it was made of rice paper, thin, transparent, holding more than it should. She took her plate last, cradled it in both hands, fingers tracing the grooves of her name. When she looked up, the foreman gave her a short, crooked smile and simply said, "Safe journey." She wanted to say thank you, but the words wouldn't come. So she bowed, deeply, from the waist, slower than tradition required, slower than habit allowed. When she rose, their eyes were still on her. No one laughed. No one moved. She turned, stepped out into the night, and walked back toward the shed, the tin plate held to her chest like a shield or a prayer. She did not look back. She could not bear to. The ship that carried her across the Pacific smelled of metal, salt, and too many lives pressed together in quiet dread. She kept to herself, cradling the tin plate wrapped in cloth, the carved spoon tucked inside the fold, and the bundle of unsent letters pressed flat against her chest. No one asked her what she carried. No one asked her where she had been. Among the repatriated, silence was as common as breath. When land finally rose from the horizon, gray, broken, familiar, her knees weakened. Japan, but not the Japan she had left. The harbors were shattered. Warehouses gutted, the smell of smoke lingered even where the fires had died long ago. Women with hollow cheeks waited in lines that stretched like rivers. Men limped past with canes carved from branches. Children darted between ruins, their laughter thin and brittle. She stepped onto the dock, thinner than she had ever been, but straighter somehow. The shame she had expected to crash over her like a wave did not come. Instead, she walked with her shoulders lifted, the tin plate tucked carefully into her satchel, its silent weight a reminder of another world, another truth. Her hometown was a skeleton. Streets she once knew were paved with ash. Her mother's house, gone. Only the stones of the foundation remained. From neighbors, she learned, haltingly, that her mother had survived the worst of the bombings but had been forced to relocate inland, living with distant relatives. Her brother's fate was still unknown. The words were delivered with bowed heads and careful tones, but she received them with unexpected clarity. Loss no longer frightened her. She had already shed too many versions of herself to fear one more. She found her mother at last in a village miles from the coast, older, smaller, but her eyes, still sharp as needles, widened when she saw her daughter standing in the doorway. For a long time, neither spoke. Then her mother reached forward with trembling hands and touched her daughter's face as if confirming she was real. That night, they sat by a fire built from scrap wood. Her mother asked no questions about the camp. In Japan, former prisoners of war carried a silence heavier than iron. To be captured, even to survive, was considered a fracture of duty, a shadow that could stain a family for generations. But her mother only asked, "Did they hurt you?" She shook her head. "No." And her mother, exhausted by grief that stretched too wide to hold more, simply nodded. They let the rest remain unspoken. Days passed. She helped rebuild the small house. She cooked rice stretched thin with barley. She stitched worn clothes. She lived. Quietly at first, then steadily. But every so often she would touch the carved spoon in her apron drawer, running her thumb over its uneven edges, and feel a warmth bloom in her chest. Her reckoning came in small pieces. The war she had fought within herself, between loyalty and survival, belief and truth, did not end in a single moment. It ended each time she planted a seed in their new garden and remembered the wildflowers blooming under a foreign sun. It ended each time she wrote a letter she still never sent. It ended each time she held her mother's hand and realized she no longer bowed beneath invisible burdens. Years later, when her granddaughter crawled into her lap and asked why she kept an old tin plate on the shelf, she smiled, softly, secretly. She touched the rim with reverence and said, "The war did not end in surrender, it ended with cornbread." And in that moment, the legacy she carried, the kindness of strangers, the courage to change, the quiet revolution of surviving, passed silently into another life, like a seed carried on wind. Did this story move you? Like the video and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what moment hit you the hardest. These stories deserve to be remembered.